Okay, thank you, Marge. All right, Grossmoor National Park. I went there in 1973. I was a very young park superintendent. I'd only been in Parks Canada for 4 years at that time, after graduating from Go Western, Norm, in 1969. And I found myself going there with Marion and 2 young children. Our oldest was 2 and our second one was a few weeks. So it was just getting there was an interesting thing. And Marion's grandmother was with us as well. So it was an interesting trip. I was also the first superintendent of that park. We had the official ceremony to create it just after I arrived. So you can imagine in that area, a lot changed for the people that lived there in one fell swoop. A lot of the larger communities like Rocky Harbor where we lived or Norse Point, and I'll be mentioning these, they were excluded from the park and they were called enclaves. But many smaller places, the province, when they agreed to create the park, they found little outports, like they call them, very expensive. So they were happy that if a few of them were to disappear. So we kind of got used a little bit to facilitate their policy from that point of view. But a lot of changes happened. Suddenly there was no hunting. Suddenly there was no rabbit snaring. A lot of rules. So that's what I was confronted with. And certainly Grossmoor for me was a pretty exciting place. I went from there to Cape Breton and I had a wonderful 2 years there. I was in the Trent Severn Waterway in Peterborough for a couple of years after that. Again, a very interesting job for me. I was in Banff for 4 years, which was equally exciting. And most recently, when I lived in Edmonton, I had opportunities to travel to the far north, as far as Alert, which is as far north as you can go and still be on land. So I've been very fortunate in my career and count my blessings from that point of view. But I think my start in Grossmoor was a great place to start. And I was most happy to have had that experience, and I'm hoping I can show you why. So just to remind you where Grossmoor is, it's about more than halfway up the west coast of Newfoundland. In Newfoundland, when they talk about the west coast, this is the west coast they're talking about. And it's about 2 hours north of the nearest community of any size called Deer Lake, which has an airport, and about 3 hours north of Corner Brook, which is the second biggest city in Newfoundland and where we did most of our shopping. So that's where it is. And it's the communities in Grossmoor, from the south to the north, Trout River to the south, it goes to Cow Head in the north, and Rocky Harbor and Norse Point kind of in the middle, and I'll be talking more about those. That's Grossmoor Mountain, and that's what the park is named after. Second highest spot in Newfoundland, 2,644 feet, as I recall. And there's quite a well-used trail that we started building when I was there that gets you up to the top. And it's a bit of a strenuous hike, but very doable. And I know every year that many people do it, but very imposing in the area. And this picture, and by the way, all these slides you're going to see are my slides. I took them when I lived there. So these slides are nearly 50 years old. So I hope they've all turned out okay. And we did figure out how to transfer them digitally so I could take slides and put them in this PowerPoint. So next, oh, wrong way. The community of Trout River is in the extreme south part of the park. And it's an interesting place. It probably was an outport with no road access until probably in the 60s. And it's a very nice kind of beach that you see there, but it was kind of black sand and black pebbles. It was very interesting from that point of view. The houses all along the base of that hill you see there, it was interesting. Along the top of that hill, and you can't make them out, that's where their TV aerials are. So
Just along up in there.
yeah, so they're all up on top of the hill, and with the cables running down to their houses, and that's how they got. We had one TV station there, CBC. This is Trout River. These are fish stores. That's where the fishermen stored their all their equipment. Didn't use paint very much on those ones. This is Trout River, very near the shoreline of Trout River Pond, which is a very large lake that is connected to the coast right at the community of Trout River by the Trout River, the river itself. When I took this picture, this mill had only been there about a month. And you can see what has already happened. And this part of the community is outside the park. And we didn't have anything to say about it, licensing it or permitting or anything. But it really does create a mess. But if they find a tree there, they like to cut them down and turn it into lumber. This is the wharf at Trout River. You can see the fleet is in, a fishing fleet, and they're cleaning cod, that day's catch. And it was really interesting. You'd go there and they'd stand there, clean those fish, and then haul them away for processing somewhere else. And at the right time of the year, those cod would be full of capelin, which is a prime food fish for them. And capelin are about like smelt. They're maybe 4, 5, 6 inches long, small fish, but they'd cut open the cod and all these capelin would spill out. This is on the way back from Trout River. It's an early project the park did there to build this footbridge over this creek. I think it got wiped out by a flood a year later. But you can see on the left side of this slide, it's all normal and green, and trees and grass and so on. I've got a slide or two of the other side, on the right-hand side of the picture, is what they call the Serpentine Tableland, and this is it. And here you can see the green stops, and that brown rock it's very acidic. And this is one of the features of Grossmoor National Park that make it so unique. It's a very, there's not very many places in the world where you could find that kind of rock. And normally where you can find it is in the high north. But here it is on the west coast of Newfoundland. And nothing grows in it, hardly anything. That bit of snow there, by the way, it's there all year, that little bit of snow. This is the top of the tableland, the Serpentine Tableland. This green you do see here is called a string bog. And again, the only other place you'll find string bogs is in the high Arctic. So a very characteristic of serpentine features, and not unusual to see in a serpentine, but to have it there in Newfoundland, very strange and very, very unique. Now we're getting into Bun Bay, very big bay on the west coast of Newfoundland. It's outside the park while the park ends at high water mark. But these are two communities, Woody Point and Winterhouse Brook, which are along the south coast of Bun Bay. Over here, very large bay. There's quite a bit of fishing in it. And here's another shot of Bun Bay. I've got two reasons to show you this. One, you can see the highway in the background there, the road fill. And that highway is the main highway along the northern peninsula. It was probably finished in the mid to late 60s. The horse, it's a private horse, but in Newfoundland they have what they call the free range law. And that means simply if you don't want this horse in your yard, you have to put up a fence to keep it out. People that have livestock do not have to keep them fenced in. So you can be driving along that highway, particularly north of the park, and you'll find sheep and horses, occasionally cattle, just wandering around. And again, if you didn't want them somewhere, you had to fence them out. Very interesting local law there. This is Bun Bay, and this is what we call the Norse Point Ferry. At that time, they had two ferries. This was a good one because you could drive on and drive off. They had another one where you drove on and backed off, which was kind of exciting. But this traveled between Woody Point that I mentioned earlier on the south side of Bun Bay and Norse Point on the north side. And they don't have these ferries anymore. If you want to get from the north side to the south side, it's a fairly long drive to go around, which I think is a shame. It was quite a feature in our time then. This is a fairly large fish store in Norse Point, just almost right beside where the ferry docks. You can see the lobster stacked up there, waiting for lobster season. This one looks kind of decrepit and so on, but I can assure you it's still used, or it was then. This is the view across Rocky Harbor, and this is the entrance to Bun Bay beyond that first point of land. And those points of land, those high hills you see off in the distance, they head south towards Trout River. So in the foreground is Rocky Harbor. Beyond that point is the entrance to Bun Bay. This is the Rocky Harbor fishing fleet. Rocky Harbor is where we lived. Their park staff, I think there were 6 mobile homes that we lived in there. Ours was 60 by 12 with our 2 children and a dog. So it was a bit crowded, but it was fishing season. It was quite busy. This is where that picture across the mouth of Rocky Harbor was taken from, Lobster Cove Lighthouse. We got Marion up that lighthouse one time, but we had a heck of a time getting her down. But it's now it's part of the park, and it's used as an interpretive center, a quasi museum, but a very, very picturesque spot. Now this, I mentioned, I hope you can see this. It's a staircase that was built along the trail to Grossmoor that I mentioned earlier. And the local staff there, a crew of men, decided it was too steep. So they built this staircase. And amazingly, you'd say, we need a staircase there. And they would say, okay, mate, we'll build one. And so they built one. It was pretty amazing. Now here's the top of Grossmoor. It's the only picture I could find of the top of Grossmoor. You can see there's an attempt to make it higher than 2,644 feet. This is the chief park warden here, a chap named Freeman Timmons. This chap, his name is Steve Kuhn, was a senior guy from Ottawa who was visiting. And of course, Marion got her first and only helicopter ride that day. That's why she was there. Now we're traveling north from Rocky Harbor. This is a little community called Baker's Brook. And this is one of those communities that is inside the park. So people were not allowed by agreement to live here permanently anymore. But they could come back here to fish in the summer. and they called those summer fishing stages. And so they would move out in late spring, and they'd fish from these communities. There's, I think, 4 or 5 of them along the coast in the park, and fish until the fall. Again, a couple of fish stores. The thing I really liked about this picture, aside from the boat, you can see that there's a winch right at the bow of that boat that they push a big pole through and walk it around. And that's how they pull the boat up out of the water. Handmade, obviously. This I call my hay rake at rest. And that was probably just used, and then it was laying against the fence. Again, in Baker's Brook. And this is an aerial shot of Baker's Brook Pond. You can see the river that connects that pond to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And you can see the effect of the glacier, steep sides, although Baker's Brook Pond is not as dramatic as Western Brook Pond, which is, I think, the next thing. Yeah, this is Western Brook Pond, very dramatic. And you can see here, it's kind of sinuous, and that's the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the background. And those cliffs are 2,000 feet high. There's another shot of it. Just it's the highlight of the park in many ways. And that what they call a pond is probably 600 feet deep. It's very deep. And it's, say, 2,000-foot cliffs. And it goes into the cliffs about, I'd say, 1.5 miles or a little more. We did allow fishing when we were there. They don't anymore. The problem with fishing in this lake is that it's so nutrient poor that the fish, if you throw anything in the water that looks like food, they'll bite. And it would have been very easy to fish that out, mainly trout. That's Baker's Brook, or Western Brook Pond, from the end of the boardwalk, when you walk in from the highway. And you can see that's the mouth of the gorge there, and then it starts winding its way inland. And the lake spreads out on the coastal plain. Just a beautiful spot. Another shot of Western Brook Pond. That slope there, that cliff, just carries on straight down to about 550 or 600 feet. Pretty amazing. There's a waterfall. I think it's up in this cleft here. You can't quite see it. The locals refer to it as Pissing Mare Falls. If you could see it, you'd understand why they said that. Now here's a local chap named Reg Williams, and he was our boat guy on Western Brook Pond. And he was a fount of all knowledge, fisherman through most of his life, but he did manage to get a boat and a couple of motors up to the pond from the coast. I assume they either dragged it over the snow in the winter or managed to get it up Western Brook, which has some very shallow water in it. But anyway, he had those boats there. And it's now they've developed it as quite a tourist thing. They have larger boats and tourist boats. But at that time, that's it. If you wanted to get on the water at Western Brook Pond, you called Reg. This is the boardwalk. About a 2-mile walk. And more than half of it was boardwalk across these bogs. And then there was, I think, 2 ridges, like you see here, where you got a few feet above the bogs. This happens to be my brother and my nephew, who's now 50.
52.
We had a crew from Sally's Cove, which is not far from here on the coast. And Johnny Welch was the foreman. And I remember saying to him, we need to build a boardwalk. And I don't want it to be very straight, you know. And I went up there a few weeks before it was done to see how they were doing. And there was this very gentle curve. And I said, Johnny, that's kind of straight, isn't it? Anyway, when we went up a few weeks later to see the final product, they put a big S in it. And my goodness, that wasn't what I wanted to have happen. But it was a great thing. And we had to build that boardwalk because people were going in there. And you can imagine through those bogs, how that trail was getting wider and wider. So we just had to make it easier for people to get there. Now, this is, most of this picture is Tuckamoor, what locally they call it Tuckamoor. And it's just spruce and fir, and it's all tangled up together. There's no way you or I could walk through that Tuckamoor. It's just impenetrable. That bull moose that you can see there just ran through it. I couldn't believe it from the helicopter. He was just running through that bush, and didn't seem to be a problem for him. Couldn't believe it. Now, this is up near a place called Cow Head, we're getting towards the north of the park now. And the haystack is, they need it for their sheep and a few cattle and so on that they have there. I have a second haystack I want to show you. This one, they protect the hay with the plastic, and they just keep putting the hay up under it, and it goes up that pole. But the next one is much neater. It's they just stack it under that little roof, so the roof climbs those 4 poles, and by the time they've done, they got a haystack as high as those poles are, and then they pull it out from the bottom. This is one of my favorite pictures. That's an outhouse up near Cow Head, and you can see they don't want it to blow over. so it's well protected. Because it would blow over, you get a lot of wind there. This is just inside the northern boundary of the park. You can see the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the background. It's a place called Shallow Bay, and it's a gorgeous sand beach, except the water is very cold. And these are sand dunes, and obviously the sand dunes are moving because at that time we were having to grade the sand off the road. It was migrating inland. And as it was migrating, it was uncovering these trees that they had totally buried. The sand at one time covered those trees. And as you can see, they're gone. And if too much more sand moves, they'll probably get blown over. But that's what it looked like in 1974, give or take. I just like this tree. I refer to this, Norm, like your gnarly bricks. This is a gnarly tree. Again, up near Sally's Cove, or up near Cow Head, and I just like the tree. And that's sunset over Rocky Harbor. That would be a view that we would see from our porch on our trailer. Sunset over the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And that's basically all the pictures. As you can see, it's a beautiful spot. There's the Serpentine Tableland in the south. Shallow Bay, there's some glorious spots there. The people were wonderful. They could do anything with a small engine. They needed to be very handy because they needed it to survive, whether they were fishing and had their one putt dory, their single dory, or skidoos. They loved their skidoos, but they needed to be able to fix anything, and they did. We had a program there one year of trying to pick up all the old cars that had been abandoned all over the place. And we learned very quickly that we had to get permission before we could move it, because quite often they just use those abandoned cars as parts supplies. So, but we hauled a lot of old cars out of there. And as I say, like Johnny Welch from Sally's Cove, who built that boardwalk, they built a footbridge over on one of those ridges I showed you. And it was an arch bridge out of wood, found material. And I was showing the tourism minister from New Brunswick. He came over to visit one day, and I was showing him this bridge, and he asked me, well, do you have drawings for that bridge? I said, no, we don't actually. We can take pictures. And, you know, oh, you must have as-built drawings. I said, no. Well, how did you do that? I said, well, the crew of men had to build a bridge, so they did. There it is. And that's how they did things. They were very remarkable and resourceful people that lived there. And what else can I tell you? In Rocky Harbor at Norse Point, Norse Point was where the ferry was. Rocky Harbor, where we lived, it was about 5 miles, 6 miles apart. But Norse Point was a very important place because that's where the hospital was. And it was a cottage hospital. They still have cottage hospitals in Newfoundland. And they had 3 doctors maybe, yes, and a head nurse, and the nurses there did everything. Marion worked there for most of the time we were there, and found herself doing things that she would not thought she would have done normally. She tells a story of one chap that brought his pregnant wife to have a baby delivered and left her there and said, call me when she's better. It was funny.
And we also did coffins when we died.
Yeah. No, it was a very interesting spot. And since then, they built a new hospital in Norse Point, which we saw a few years ago when we were there, which looks kind of out of place for me. It was very modern. When we did visit there a couple of years ago with some friends of ours, we stayed at a B&B, and when we knocked on the door, the woman named Dot Shears came to the door and said, we introduced ourselves, and she said, we used to have a superintendent here with your name. I said, well, that would be me. And so after that, it was hail fellow, well met. And we ended up at a church supper, and it was a great time. They had great parties there. Anyway, that was my beginning as a superintendent in the national park system. Couldn't have found a better place to do it from. Great people, great scenery, great culture. And I treasure the couple of years I spent there. And I ended up moving there and to Cape Breton, which is another story sometime if you want. But a very interesting place, and I can encourage you to go. They have great hiking there. Since we've been there, we left there in 1975, and they've done a huge amount of the tourism thing has really caught on for Rocky Harbor and the other communities there. A few new roads have been built. They certainly have, there's a number of B&Bs and small motels. There's a lot more to do now, and a lot to see, as I hope I've shown you. So I can only, if you're looking for some place to visit and you've not been to that part of the world, go.